The day began as any other, a whirlwind of morning chaos. My son Ethan chattered endlessly about dinosaurs while I hurried to get us ready. It wasn't until the end of the day, as I picked him up from kindergarten, that the rhythm of our ordinary life began to crack. Ethan was in high spirits, proudly showing off a crayon drawing he'd made of the two of us battling a fire-breathing dragon. I smiled, ruffling his hair. "Good job, buddy. Let's get home and show Mom." The drive home was uneventful. We pulled into the driveway, the house bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. I carried Ethan inside, his small hand clutching mine. He ran to the living room, eager to add his latest masterpiece to the gallery on the fridge. I followed, my thoughts already on dinner. But then something felt off. The air in the house carried an unnatural stillness, a subtle shift I couldn't pinpoint. Ethan's chatter filled the background as I walked upstairs to our bedroom to change. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, expecting the same comforting disarray, pillows askew, laundry in a corner, but my eyes landed on something that didn't belong. There on the bed, folded neatly as if taunting me, was a pair of men's underwear. Not mine. My heart stopped, my mind struggling to process the sight. The stark contrast of the foreign fabric against our bed sheets burned into my brain. I stared, frozen, as 1,000 questions exploded in my head. Ethan's voice snapped me back. "Daddy, can we have pizza for dinner?" I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his innocent eyes lighting up the gloom that had settled over me. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Sure, buddy. Why don't you go pick out a movie while I get changed?" He nodded, bounding down the stairs without a care in the world. I closed the door behind him, my hands trembling as I turned back to the bed. This couldn't be real. There had to be some explanation. Maybe I'd overlooked something. Maybe, but the rationalizations crumbled as I noticed something else. A faint scent lingering in the air. Not the familiar mix of our laundry detergent and Rachel's perfume, but something distinctly masculine. My stomach churned. The trust I had taken for granted felt like it was slipping through my fingers, replaced by a gnawing dread. My mind raced, pulling fragments of the past few weeks into sharper focus. Rachel's late nights at work, the sudden secrecy with her phone, the unexplained tension I had dismissed as stress. Was I blind, or had I just refused to see? I sat down on the bed, the foreign fabric still mocking me from its place on the quilt. I reached out hesitantly, as though touching it would confirm my worst fears. The texture was different, unfamiliar. The lump in my throat grew tighter. I stood abruptly, my breath coming in short bursts. I couldn't stay here, not in this room. Grabbing my phone, I stepped into the hallway and called Rachel. "Hey, love," she answered cheerfully. "How's Ethan?" I could hear the familiar sounds of her office in the background. The sound that once comforted me now felt like a lie. "Fine," I said, my voice strained. "When are you coming home?" "Another hour or so," she replied. "Why? Everything okay?" I hesitated, my grip tightening on the phone. "We'll talk when you get here." There was a pause. "All right," she said cautiously. "See you soon." As I hung up, my chest heaved with a mix of anger and despair. The hours that followed crawled by, each tick of the clock amplifying my unease. I distracted myself with Ethan, pretending to care about his movie, while my mind replayed the scene in the bedroom over and over. When Rachel finally walked through the door, her smile faltered as she saw me waiting. Ethan ran to her, wrapping his arms around her legs. "Mommy, Daddy said we're having pizza." She kissed his head absently, her eyes locked on mine. "That's great, sweetheart. Why don't you go wash up?" He bounded off, leaving us alone in the hallway. Rachel set her bag down, her expression wary. "Is something wrong?" she asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and walked upstairs, knowing she would follow. I stopped at the bedroom doorway, gesturing for her to enter first. She stepped inside, her brow furrowed. "What is this about?" Her words trailed off as her eyes landed on the bed. Her face paled, and for a moment, we were both silent. "Explain this," I said, my voice low and sharp. Rachel blinked, her mouth opening and closing, as if searching for the right words. I don't know what that is." "Don't lie to me," I snapped. the anger I had been holding back breaking free. "That's not mine, Rachel. So whose is it?" Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the dresser. I, I don't know, she stammered. I let out a bitter laugh, the sound foreign even to my ears. "You don't know? That's the best you've got?" Her silence was deafening. I felt the room spin as a wave of betrayal crashed over me. The woman I had built my life with, the mother of my child, how could she do this? "Get out," I said finally, my voice trembling with rage. "I don't want to look at you right now." She flinched as though I had struck her, but she didn't argue. She grabbed her things and left the room without another word. I stood there, the silence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't bear. Ethan's laughter echoed from downstairs, a cruel reminder of the innocence I had to protect. I sank onto the bed, staring at the thing that had unraveled everything. I wasn't sure how, but I knew this was only the beginning. Looking back, the cracks were always there. Tiny at first, like hairline fractures in a window pane, subtle enough to ignore if you didn't want to see them. And I didn't. I convinced myself that Rachel and I were just going through a rough patch, that the strain of parenting and work was taking its toll on both of us. But now, with hindsight as my cruel guide, I can see how the pieces fit together. It started with the phone. Rachel had always been an open book, the type to leave her phone lying around without a second thought. But a few months ago, that changed. Her phone became an extension of her hand, always with her, always buzzing with notifications she was quick to dismiss or silence. She'd smile down at the screen, a faint curve of her lips that felt too private, too intimate. "Work emails," she'd explain, brushing off my curiosity. "You know how demanding they've been lately." I wanted to believe her. I did believe her. Rachel had worked so hard to climb the corporate ladder, and I'd always admired her dedication. But there was something in the way she avoided eye contact when she said it, the way her fingers lingered on the phone even after the notification disappeared, that made my chest tighten with unease. Then there were the late nights. Rachel's job had always required her to work long hours now and then, but these were different. She stopped coming home at the usual time, her work dinners stretching later into the evening. When I called to check in, she'd answer quickly, her voice tinged with impatience. "I'm in the middle of something," she'd say. "I'll be home soon." "Okay," I'd reply, trying to sound supportive. But the word felt like a lump in my throat, heavy with doubt. Soon became later and later. I'd put Ethan to bed, cleaning up the remnants of our dinner as the hours ticked by. When Rachel finally walked through the door, she'd smile at me, distracted, tired, and head straight to the shower. By the time she climbed into bed, I was left staring at her back, wondering when the woman who once couldn't wait to tell me about her day had become a stranger. I started to question myself. Was I imagining things? Was I being paranoid? Rachel had never given me a reason to doubt her before. Maybe this was just the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage, the kind of thing everyone went through eventually. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Are you okay?" I asked her one night as we lay in bed, the space between us feeling like a chasm. "You've seemed distant lately." She rolled over to face me, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I admitted, struggling to find the right words. "You've been working so much, and we don't talk like we used to. I just, I miss you." Her expression softened, and she reached out to take my hand. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice gentle. "Work's been crazy lately, and I guess I've been letting it get to me." "I didn't mean to make you feel that way." I squeezed her hand, relief washing over me. "It's okay. I just want to make sure we're okay." "We are," she said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "I promise." But her promises felt hollow in the weeks that followed. The late nights continued, as did the moments where she seemed lost in her own world, her phone lighting up with messages she was quick to hide. I tried to rationalize it. Rachel was under a lot of pressure at work, and I knew she didn't want to burden me with her stress. She was probably just venting to a friend, someone who understood the corporate grind better than I did. Still, the doubts lingered. One weekend, I suggested a date night, a chance to reconnect, to remind ourselves of what we had built together. Rachel agreed, but when the night came, she seemed distracted. Her laughter felt forced, her smiles fleeting. Even as we sat across from each other in the cozy restaurant where we'd celebrated our anniversary years ago, I couldn't shake the feeling that her mind was elsewhere. "You're quiet tonight," I said, trying to draw her out. "Sorry," she said, snapping back to the present. "I guess I'm just tired." "Tired," I repeated, forcing a smile. "That seems to be the theme lately." She looked at me then, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But she quickly masked it, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I love you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I love you too," I replied, my heart aching with the weight of those words. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that love was enough to hold us together, even as the cracks in our foundation grew deeper. In the days that followed, I began paying closer attention. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who snooped or accused without evidence, but the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't let me rest. I noticed the way Rachel's tone changed when she answered certain calls, the way she would step into another room, lowering her voice just enough that I couldn't make out the words. "Who was that?" I asked once, as she returned to the living room, her face flushed. "Just a coworker," she said casually. "We're finalizing the details for a big project." I nodded, trying to suppress the flicker of doubt. Rachel had always been charismatic, the type of person people gravitated toward. It wasn't unusual for her to form close relationships with her colleagues, but there was something about the way she avoided my gaze, the way she immediately changed the subject, that made my chest tighten. I didn't want to confront her, not yet. If I was wrong, I risked shattering the trust that held us together. But if I was right, I wasn't sure I was ready to face the truth. And so, I did what I thought was best. I waited. I watched. And I told myself that everything would be okay. Her name was Karen, an ironic choice given how many cliches about bad influences fit her perfectly. Karen was Rachel's friend from work, or so Rachel claimed. She'd shown up in our lives a little over a year ago, introduced casually as her new office buddy. At first, I didn't think much of her. She was bubbly and extroverted, the kind of person who could talk a mile a minute about absolutely nothing. But beneath her sparkling personality was an edge, a sharpness that made me uneasy. Karen had a way of making herself the center of attention. Whenever she came over, the conversation revolved around her latest drama, her bold opinions, or her wild nights out. Rachel, who had always been grounded and pragmatic, seemed enthralled by her. Karen was everything Rachel wasn't: carefree, reckless, and unapologetically self-indulgent. It wasn't long before Rachel started spending more time with her. At first, it was the occasional happy hour after work, then weekend brunches that stretched into the late afternoon. I didn't mind at first. Rachel deserved to have her own social life. But as Karen's presence grew, so did my unease. Karen wasn't just a friend, she was an instigator. I saw it in the way she encouraged Rachel to drink a little too much, to flirt a little too openly, to live a little, as she put it. I hated how Karen's influence seemed to seep into Rachel's life, changing her in ways I didn't understand. One night, Rachel came home from one of their outings, her laughter ringing out as she stumbled through the door. She was clearly drunk, her cheeks flushed and her eyes glassy. I caught her before she could fall, steadying her as she giggled into my chest. "Had a good time?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "The best!" she exclaimed, pulling back to look at me. "Karen knows all the best spots. You should come next time." I forced a smile. "Maybe," but I knew I wouldn't. Karen made it clear that she didn't like me, even if she hid it behind her fake smile and overly enthusiastic greetings. She was always quick to remind Rachel of all the things she was missing out on by being tied down with a husband and a child. "Rachel, you're still young," I'd overheard her say once during a barbecue we hosted. "You've got time to live your life before you get old and boring. You don't have to let being a mom define you." I'd clenched my jaw so tightly that day I thought my teeth might crack. Rachel had laughed, brushing it off as a joke, but I saw the way Karen's words lingered in her eyes. The real tipping point came one Saturday afternoon when Rachel and Karen were out at what Rachel had called a quick lunch. Hours passed, and when I finally called her to ask when she'd be home, she answered with laughter in the background. "Relax, babe," she said breezily. "We're just having a good time. Karen says I need to learn to let go more. You can handle Ethan, right?" The dismissal in her tone stung. Of course I can handle him, I replied, keeping my voice steady. But we miss you here. There was a pause, then a sigh. I'll be back soon. She didn't come home until after dark. When she finally walked through the door, her face was flushed with a mix of guilt and annoyance. Don't start, she said before I could say anything. Karen needed me today, okay? She's going through a lot. Karen always seems to need you, I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. What about us? What about Ethan? Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the walls going up. This isn't about Karen, she snapped. You're just upset because I have a life outside of this house. That's not fair, I shot back. I'm upset because it feels like you're prioritizing her over us. I'm allowed to have friends, you know, she said, crossing her arms. Not everything is about you. It wasn't worth arguing. I could see that much. Rachel was defensive, and Karen had clearly positioned herself as a safe haven from the responsibilities of family life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was more than just a bad influence. She was a catalyst, someone who encouraged Rachel to question the life we'd built together. I started paying closer attention. Karen's name came up more often, usually in passing. Karen says I should try this new workout class. Karen thinks we should do a girls' trip to Vegas. Karen said the funniest thing today. Each mention was like a splinter under my skin, small but impossible to ignore. Then came the night that solidified my distrust. Rachel and I had planned a quiet evening together. Dinner, a movie, just the two of us. It was rare these days, and I'd been looking forward to it. But an hour before she was supposed to come home, I got a text. Rachel, Karen's having a tough day. She really needs me. Rain check? I stared at the message, anger and disappointment bubbling inside me. Rachel didn't even bother to call, didn't give me the courtesy of hearing her voice. It was Karen, again. I replied with a simple, okay, but the truth was, I wasn't okay, not even close. As the days turned into weeks, my resentment toward Karen grew. I hated how she seemed to have a hold on Rachel, how she encouraged her to put herself first at the expense of our family. I hated how Rachel defended her, how any criticism I voiced was met with excuses. Karen's just misunderstood, she'd say. She's been through a lot, and she doesn't have anyone else. But I wasn't buying it. Karen wasn't misunderstood. She was manipulative. And Rachel, whether she realized it or not, was falling for it. The final straw came when Ethan mentioned her name. We were sitting at the dinner table when he looked up from his plate, his little brow furrowed. Daddy, is Karen Mommy's best friend? I froze, my fork hovering midair. Why do you ask, buddy? Because Mommy talks about her all the time, he said innocently. More than she talks about you. I forced a smile, ruffling his hair. Mommy has a lot of friends, but you and I are her favorites, okay? He grinned, satisfied with my answer, but the weight of his words settled heavy on my chest. Karen wasn't just a friend. She was a wedge, driving Rachel further and further away from us. And I was starting to wonder if I could compete with the life Karen was offering. A life without responsibility, without accountability, without me. It happened on a quiet evening, one of those rare moments when the house felt calm. Ethan was asleep in his room, the faint glow of his nightlight spilling into the hallway. I sat in the living room scrolling aimlessly through my phone while the TV droned on in the background. Rachel was in the kitchen, her voice muffled as she spoke on the phone. I wasn't paying much attention at first, but something about her tone caught my ear. It wasn't her usual light-hearted chatter or even the firm professionalism she used at work. It was low, intimate, a voice she used to reserve for me. I muted the TV, straining to hear her words. I know, but I can't right now, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's here. The knot in my stomach tightened. I'll call you later, okay? She continued, her tone soft and pleading. I miss you too. The phone clicked and the sound of her footsteps approached. I quickly turned the TV volume back up, pretending to be engrossed in whatever forgettable show was on. Rachel walked into the living room, her face flushed, her movements hurried. She avoided looking at me as she headed upstairs. For a moment, I sat there frozen. My heart pounded, my mind racing with possibilities. Who had she been talking to? And why did it sound so secretive? I couldn't ignore it anymore. When I finally stood, my legs felt heavy, as though they were resisting the truth I was about to uncover. I made my way upstairs and found Rachel in the bathroom, her phone left unattended on the nightstand. It wasn't like me to invade her privacy. In the 20 years we'd been together, I'd never felt the need to check her phone. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, I needed answers. My hands trembled as I picked it up, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain she'd hear it. The screen lit up, revealing a string of recent messages. Sam, I can't stop thinking about you. Last night was incredible. Rachel, I know. I feel the same. I wish things were simpler. The words blurred before my eyes, their meaning too painful to fully register. I scrolled up, each message more damning than the last. Photos, emojis, plans made and reminisced about. All of it painted a vivid, undeniable picture. It was him, Sam, my best friend. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. My breathing quickened, my chest tightening as a wave of anger, betrayal, and disbelief washed over me. How could she? How could he? The sound of the bathroom door opening jolted me. Rachel stepped out, her face turning pale as she saw me holding her phone. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp, defensive. I held up the screen, my hand shaking. "What the hell is this, Rachel?" Her eyes widened, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. "Sam!" I spat, my voice rising. "You're cheating on me with Sam? My best friend?" "It's not what it looks like," she stammered, stepping forward as though to take the phone from me. "Not what it looks like?" I repeated, my voice dripping with incredulity. "So these messages don't mean what they say? These photos, this affair, is just some misunderstanding?" She looked away, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice barely audible. "Didn't mean for what to happen, Rachel?" I snapped, taking a step closer. "You didn't mean to sleep with him? To lie to me? To destroy our family?" "Please, just let me explain," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. I laughed bitterly, the sound foreign and hollow. "Explain? Go ahead, Rachel. Explain to me how you thought this was okay. Explain how you could look me in the eye every day and pretend like nothing was wrong." Her tears fell harder, but I felt no sympathy, not this time. "I wasn't happy," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I didn't feel seen anymore. Sam made me feel alive." Her words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. "So that's your excuse? You weren't happy, so you decided to destroy everything we built together?" "It wasn't like that," she insisted, her voice rising. "I never meant to hurt you, I swear." "But you did hurt me, Rachel," I shouted, my anger boiling over. "You hurt me. You hurt Ethan. And for what? For some fling with someone I trusted like a brother?" Her face crumpled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, sobbing into her hands. "I didn't know how to stop," she whispered. "I didn't know how to fix it." "You could have talked to me," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of rage and despair. "You could have told me you were unhappy. But instead, you chose this. You chose him." The room fell silent, the weight of our shattered lives pressing down on both of us. "I can't even look at you right now," I said finally, my voice cold. "You've destroyed everything." Rachel looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am." "Sorry isn't enough," I replied, stepping back toward the door. "I don't know if anything ever will be." I left the room without another word, the sound of her sobs following me down the hallway. Downstairs, I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. The betrayal was suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I thought about Ethan, about how this would affect him, about the future I thought we had that now felt like a cruel lie. The man I'd trusted most in the world had betrayed me. The woman I'd built my life with had chosen him over me. I sat there for hours, the pain and disbelief twisting inside me, until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The morning after the discovery felt surreal, as though the previous night's storm had passed but left the wreckage scattered everywhere. Rachel didn't come downstairs immediately. I heard her moving around upstairs, her footsteps hesitant, her presence a shadow of what it used to be. When she finally appeared, she looked tired but composed, her eyes puffy from crying. I expected remorse, maybe an apology, or even an admission of guilt. What I didn't expect was the calm, calculated way she began to talk. "We need to discuss what happened," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. Her voice was steady, her tone measured, almost detached. "There's nothing to discuss," I replied flatly. "You cheated, Rachel. You lied. What more is there to say?" She sighed, her expression one of practiced patience. "I think you're blowing this out of proportion." I blinked, stunned by her audacity. "Blowing this out of proportion? I caught you having an affair, Rachel, with my best friend. How is that something I'm exaggerating?" Her eyes narrowed slightly and she leaned forward, her voice soft but pointed. "You don't understand what I've been going through. You've been so distant lately, wrapped up in your own world. Did you really not see how unhappy I was?" There it was, the shift, the subtle redirection of blame. "I was distant?" I asked, incredulous. "You're the one who's been sneaking around and lying to my face, Rachel. Don't you dare try to make this about me." "I'm not making it about you," she said, her voice calm and even. "I'm just saying that things haven't been good between us for a long time. Maybe if you'd paid more attention, you'd have noticed that." I stared at her, my hands clenching into fists under the table. "You're seriously trying to blame me for your affair?" "I'm not blaming anyone," she said with a shrug. "I'm just saying it takes two people to make a marriage work. And lately, it's felt like I've been the only one trying." The audacity of her words left me momentarily speechless. I searched her face for any hint of remorse, any flicker of guilt. But all I saw was cold detachment. "You think sneaking off with Sam was you trying?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. "Was that your way of fixing things?" Her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms. "Sam listened to me. He understood me in ways you stopped trying to. You're so busy being the perfect father, the perfect provider. But you forgot about me, about what I needed." Her words hit me like a slap. For a moment, I questioned myself. Had I neglected her? Had I been so focused on Ethan and my own responsibilities that I failed to see her slipping away? But then I remembered the nights I'd stayed up waiting for her to come home, the times I'd suggested date nights only to be brushed off, the mornings when I'd asked if she was okay, only to be met with vague assurances. "You don't get to rewrite history," I said finally, my voice firm. "I was there, Rachel. I tried. I asked. You chose to shut me out. You chose to lie." She sighed, her frustration evident. "Maybe I lied because I knew how you'd react. You're so intense about everything. I couldn't even talk to you without feeling judged or criticized." "Judged?" I repeated, my voice rising. "I never judged you, Rachel. I trusted you. I trusted you with everything. And you threw it all away." She looked away, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You're being dramatic," she said after a moment. "People make mistakes. Sam and it wasn't even serious. It was just something I needed at the time." "Something you needed," I echoed bitterly. "You destroyed our family for something you needed." "You're acting like I don't care," she snapped, her voice finally breaking with anger. "But I do care. I care about us, about Ethan. I lost myself for a little while. And maybe if you weren't so focused on everything else, you would have noticed." Her words twisted in my mind, planting seeds of doubt that I hated myself for watering. Was I to blame? Had I failed her in some fundamental way? But even as I questioned myself, the anger burned brighter. This wasn't my fault. I wasn't the one who betrayed our vows, who invited betrayal into our home. "You're unbelievable," I said, standing from the table. "You've twisted everything to suit your narrative. But the truth is, you're selfish, Rachel. You didn't care about me or Ethan when you made those choices. You cared about yourself. And now you're trying to make me feel guilty for not stopping you." Her eyes glistened with tears, but I didn't believe them anymore. "What do you want me to say?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That I'm a terrible person? That I'm the only one at fault here? Fine. If that makes you feel better, go ahead and think that. I don't need your permission to know the truth," I said coldly. I turned and walked away, leaving her sitting there, her tears falling silently. Upstairs, I locked myself in the bedroom and sank onto the bed, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Her words lingered in my mind, their poison seeping into the cracks of my already fragile self-esteem. Maybe I had been distant. Maybe I hadn't been enough. But deep down, I knew this wasn't my fault. This was her choice, her betrayal, and no amount of manipulation or gaslighting would change that. The days that followed were a haze of numbness and overthinking. Each time I tried to move forward, Rachel's words would echo in my mind, pulling me back into a spiral of doubt. Maybe if you'd paid more attention, you stopped trying to understand me. Sam made me feel alive. At first, I let those words burrow deep. I replayed every interaction, every moment where I might have failed her, where I might have missed a chance to be better. Had I been too focused on Ethan, too wrapped up in work, too comfortable in the routines of our life? In those quiet hours after Ethan went to bed, I wrestled with the kind of questions no one prepares you for. What if I wasn't enough? What if I'd driven her to this? I'd made mistakes. I knew that. I wasn't perfect, not as a husband or as a father. But did imperfection justify betrayal? I tried to balance the weight of her accusations with the reality of what I knew. I wasn't the one who lied. I wasn't the one who brought someone else into our marriage. I wasn't the one who put my selfish desires above my family. But still, the doubts lingered. One evening, as I sat in Ethan's room watching him sleep, the enormity of it all threatened to crush me. His small chest rose and fell with the rhythm of childhood innocence, a stark contrast to the chaos raging inside me. I thought about what this would do to him if we couldn't hold it together, about the life he'd have if our family fractured beyond repair. What kind of man was I becoming? I ran a hand through my hair, gripping the back of my neck as the thoughts churned. I had to fix this, for Ethan's sake, for all of us. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize her actions or excuse her behavior, I couldn't escape the truth staring me in the face. Rachel didn't care about fixing things. Not really. Her apologies were empty, more about easing her guilt than making amends. Every conversation we had felt like a chess game where she was constantly trying to shift the blame or justify the unjustifiable. The more I thought about it, the more her words unraveled. I didn't feel seen anymore, she had said, but how often had I asked her how she was feeling, only to be met with vague reassurances or avoidance? How often had I tried to connect, only to find her already a million miles away? It wasn't serious, she'd claimed, but the messages I saw told a different story, a story of shared secrets, of longing, of intimacy that went far beyond a meaningless fling. Sam made me feel alive. Those words haunted me the most. What about the life we'd built together? Wasn't that enough for her? Wasn't I enough? It hit me then, like a punch to the gut. No matter what I'd done or hadn't done, her choices were her own. She hadn't just slipped or made a mistake. She had consciously and repeatedly chosen to betray me, to betray Ethan. And no amount of blame shifting or gaslighting could change that. I stood pacing the room as the pieces of the puzzle came together. Rachel's manipulation had been subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but now it was clear. Every time she deflected, every time she twisted the narrative, she was protecting herself, not us. Her coldness, her lack of true remorse, they weren't just signs of guilt. They were signs of someone who had already made peace with her actions, someone who believed her happiness was more important than the wreckage she left behind. For so long, I'd carried the weight of our marriage on my shoulders, believing it was my job to hold everything together. But now I realized that no amount of effort on my part could compensate for Rachel's choices. This wasn't my failure, it was hers. I returned to my room that night with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I stared at the framed photo of our family on the nightstand, taken during a trip to the beach last summer. We'd all been smiling, the kind of smiles you'd expect from a happy, whole family. But now I wondered how much of that happiness had been real. I thought about Ethan, about the kind of man I wanted him to see when he looked at me. He deserved better than a father who let himself be diminished, who let someone else's lies dictate his worth. I couldn't change what Rachel had done, but I could change how I responded to it. I could stop blaming myself for her decisions. I could stop letting her manipulations control me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of resolve. Rachel's betrayal had broken something in me, but it hadn't destroyed me. I wasn't ready to forgive her, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let her drag me down with her. It was time to stop looking for answers in her lies and start finding them in myself. The house felt quieter now, not in the way it used to after Ethan went to bed, but in a way that signified a kind of peace I hadn't known in months. Rachel was gone. She'd moved out last week. The official separation was her idea, but it wasn't something I fought. If anything, it was a relief. The first night after she left, I sat alone in the living room, surrounded by the echoes of what our life had been. The weight of her absence was strange, but it didn't crush me the way I thought it would. Instead, it was like breathing fresh air after being underwater for too long. Ethan adjusted faster than I expected. Children are resilient in ways adults forget to be. He asked a few questions at first. Simple ones, like whether mommy would still see him, whether we'd still be a family. I answered honestly but gently, making sure he understood that no matter what changed, my love for him never would. Over time, his questions faded, replaced by the kind of curiosity only a 6-year-old could have. Why don't clouds fall from the sky? How do lizards regrow their tails? Could we build a robot together? He became my anchor, pulling me back into the present when my thoughts threatened to drown me in the past. For a while, I thought about Sam more than I wanted to. I imagined confronting him again, imagined shouting all the things I didn't say the first time, maybe even hitting him again. But eventually, even that faded. What was the point? He'd already proven what kind of man he was, and I refused to give him more space in my life than he'd already taken. Rachel tried reaching out a few times after she left. Her messages alternated between nostalgia and defensiveness. One day she'd send a text reminiscing about a trip we'd taken, and the next she'd ask if I'd thought about my part in what happened. I stopped responding after the third message. It wasn't that I didn't care anymore. I did, but I cared more about moving forward. In the weeks and months after Rachel's betrayal, I learned more about myself than I had in years. I learned how easily love can blind you to someone's flaws, how trust can make you ignore the signs you don't want to see. I learned how much of myself I'd given to our marriage, sometimes at the expense of my own needs and happiness. I'd thought that was what love demanded: sacrifice, compromise, endurance. But real love isn't supposed to feel like a slow erosion of who you are. I wasn't perfect, and I wasn't blameless, but I also wasn't responsible for Rachel's choices. That was the hardest lesson to learn, but also the most liberating. I started seeing a therapist, something I'd never considered before. At first, it felt strange to pour my thoughts out to a stranger, but over time, it became a lifeline. Therapy helped me untangle the mess of emotions I'd buried: anger, sadness, guilt, shame. It helped me understand that healing wasn't a straight line, but a series of small, sometimes painful steps. I learned to forgive myself, not for what happened, but for the ways I'd let it consume me. Life after Rachel wasn't easy, but it was mine again. I threw myself into being the best father I could be for Ethan. We built the robot he'd been dreaming about, well, a clunky, barely functioning version of one, and laughed until our sides hurt when it toppled over. I started cooking again, experimenting with recipes that didn't come from a box. Some were successes, others were disasters Ethan found endlessly amusing. We should leave cooking to Grandma, he joked after I burned a batch of pancakes so badly they looked like charcoal briquettes. The house slowly began to feel like a home again, not because it was perfect, but because it was ours. One evening, months after Rachel left, Ethan and I sat on the porch watching the sunset. He leaned against me, his small frame warm and solid. "Do you miss Mommy?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet. The question caught me off guard, but I didn't hesitate. "I do," I said honestly, "but sometimes people make choices that mean they can't stay in each other's lives the way they used to." He nodded, his face thoughtful. "Do you think you'll ever love someone else?" I smiled at his innocence. "Maybe," I said, "but right now I'm happy loving you." He grinned, a gap-toothed smile that lit up my heart. "Good, because I love you too, Daddy." That night after I put Ethan to bed, I sat alone in the living room, the quiet no longer feeling like an enemy. I thought about everything we'd been through, about the pain and the loss, but also about the strength it took to survive it. Rachel's betrayal had broken something in me, but it didn't destroy me. If anything, it forced me to rebuild, to rediscover the parts of myself I'd lost along the way. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. Life had a way of surprising you, I realized. It could hurt you in ways you never expected, but it could also heal you in ways you didn't think possible. And as I sat there, listening to the steady rhythm of my son's breathing down the hall, I realized I wasn't bitter anymore. Not really, because even in the ashes of betrayal, there was hope, and that was enough.